Anyway, welcome to Bleeding Edge Web. Here's our agenda for this evening. Yeah, as I was saying, we always appreciate speakers and sponsors. So sponsorship is really cheap. If your company does anything like that, we basically ask $300, covers the pizza, drinks, meetup.com, charges, fees. So there's a lot that goes into running a meetup. So if you're interested in any of that, please let me know. And as always, thanks to our wonderful host, Expedia, and Rod, I think, is going to say just a few words. So thanks, Rod, for having us out. Really appreciate it.
Oh, wow, this is a whole thing. Yes, welcome everybody. We are so happy to be able to host myself. We have Jonas over here. Raise your hand. We also have Valentine. Valentine's on my team, so no big deal, but very happy he's here. You can grab any of us if you need anything. If you need to use the bathroom, you'll just go back the way you came, and then we will have to let you back in. So just grab one of us, and we will hook you up there. But yeah, this is the third time we've done it. We're very pumped about it, and especially having Dave here. Very excited about that. I said this is like old home week from 7-8 years ago, coming to Bleeding Edge Web, watching Dave Rupert give an amazing talk. I mean, what more could we want, So anyway, welcome, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Rod. And then we often have a main sponsor. This month, it's the U.S. Army. We want you. Again, I already gave my pitch, but if you're interested, it's pretty cheap. So just come talk to me afterwards if you think that's something your company could do. All right, so libraries and frameworks. This month, I just wanted to spotlight one interesting tool that's out there that you may have heard of, and that's Bun. The big release that they came out with this month was 1.1, which is a minor release, but if you're in the Windows world, it's a pretty major release because the main thing they added was Windows support. If you're not familiar with Bun, it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife, really, because depending on your needs, it's sort of like Node and Dino in the sense of being a JavaScript runtime where you can run JavaScript on a server. They also have a cross-platform Bash-like shell. So across different systems, you can have a nice shell environment that works consistently. Some of the other things, like it's sort of an NPM-like tool, package management. Also does like transpiling, similar to other tools. So like I said, they want to be kind of an all-in-one toolkit. The other big thing that they tout is their speed. So the first thing that you'll see if you go to their site is how fast they are compared to some of these other. So good time to check them out, especially if you're on Windows. Any of that stuff sounds interesting. And then there were actually a bunch of notable kind of major releases. I'm not going to go through all these. I will just highlight one that I found really interesting, which is Babylon. So if you're not familiar, Babylon is a 3D kind of rendering engine, essentially, but it's in JavaScript. And so in the browser, I can render a little scene like this, totally dynamic. This is kind of a cool demo, too. I can regenerate all the little tokens in this scene on the fly in JavaScript. So, not everyone exactly has that use case to build stuff like that. But if you do, that out. That's called Babylon JS. Yeah. And then this is kind of a who's who of things that you probably have heard of. So again, I'm not going to go through all these, but there were some pretty big releases with some of these tools. So if you use some of these things, check them out. ESLint is a notable one that a lot of people use in their tool chain. So the major releases for ESLint typically add or tweak rules around, JavaScript, validity, that kind of stuff. So lots of interesting releases. So there's a few headlines that I wanted to talk about. One of them we actually talked about last month, if you were here. We talked about the fact that Redis, which is the open source tool for key value store / caching that a lot of people are probably familiar with, they actually dropped their open source BSD license. And so again, we talked about that last month. I'm not going to go over it again, but when I summarized it, I kind of said it probably won't affect you individually as a developer so much. It'll more affect kind of like big companies. Well, that didn't take long. a lot of the Redis maintainers from the open source side, they actually forked the last BSD version of it and have created a new project called ValKey, which is a play on value key value. Forks happen all the time in open source, so the fact that a project got forked doesn't necessarily mean anything. Forks often just kind of die after the mad people lose interest. This one actually might have some legs though, because it's number one hosted by the Linux Foundation, which is, gives it a lot of credibility from an open source standpoint. And it's also directly supported by these companies. And this is kind of the thing, when you fork a random open source project that companies don't care about, then that kind of happens and people get mad, but the world moves on. But when you change your license and your tool is used by these kinds of companies, then people take notice. And they don't just get mad about it, they actually switch into protection mode where they're protecting their own financial interests. This actually happened a few years ago with Elasticsearch, if you didn't hear about it. So Elastic did the exact same thing. They were open source and they switched to a less permissive license. And so AWS actually forked Elasticsearch and Kibana and all those tools and created OpenSearch. So there's a precedent for that happening. So again, doesn't affect you guys as directly, but if you use, for example, Redis via Google Cloud or AWS, it might actually affect you down the road in terms of the tooling that you're using. That's pretty interesting. There was also this security-related headline, the XZ backdoor. So this was pretty major. I'd be surprised if you didn't at least see the headline about it. Again, we have security things happen all the time, so that's nothing new. The thing that was interesting about this one was how subtle and sophisticated it was, and how long the people behind it kind of worked on it and set the stage for it. So this was a kind of obscure tool. If you're not like a Linux developer, you probably wouldn't directly use this tool, but it is built into a lot of software foundationally that we all use, including some of the open source Linux operating systems. And what they did was they basically created a hole in SSH, a backdoor, where with a certain SSL certificate, you could basically arbitrarily inject code onto any server that you want using this exploit. And then later trigger that code to essentially do anything arbitrarily. So it's like among the worst types of backdoors you could possibly have. And it was in one of the most core pieces of the tool chain within the Linux world that you basically have. It took multiple years of not only technical hacking, but also social engineering, which is really interesting. So if you look at how it happened, the main person behind the hack basically worked their way into the project as a maintainer, and then other people coordinated social pressure on the original maintainer to kind of like accept patches without as much review and things like that. So luckily, this random Microsoft developer who was debugging, of all things, a performance issue in some unrelated tool that he was working on, just happened to notice that SSH had slowed down in a way that he couldn't explain. So he dug into it and he found this. So, we kind of dodged a pretty big bullet, but it was mostly just by getting lucky because this one guy happened to find it. So it's pretty scary. But if you're interested in sort of the technical details of that, is actually pretty interesting. So go read up on that. This won't affect everyone, but as developers, probably a lot of us, if you've ever signed an employment agreement or if you've ever been a contractor, you often have non-compete clauses, which means that if you leave the company you're with, a lot of them will say you can't go work at a competing company, or they'll have other similar restrictions. Well, the Federal Trade Commission just outlawed that, which is a pretty sweeping change in our industry. They basically, the biggest argument about that is that it depresses earnings because it makes us less able to go out and get, jobs with competing companies that would be competitive. And they estimate, $400 billion in earnings as part of the way they justify this. And in fact, it's supposed to go into effect in 4 months. The asterisk is that they've already been sued by the Chamber of Commerce. I imagine that this will drag out for a while before, if and when it becomes law. But good to know about. Like I said, if you have an employment contract today, or if you do contracting, you should pay attention to that. And then this was an interesting one. So most of us, I'm sure, are familiar at some level with accessibility in web design. And The ADA, which is the underlying law around accessibility and more broadly, just accessibility in society, the law was enacted in 1990. But in fact, I didn't quite realize this because, if you've done any accessibility work, you know that there's organizations in the open web, like the W3C, that have all kinds of rules around accessibility. For a long time, we've had tooling where you can validate your sites and stuff like that. But there's actually technically been no legal rules around the digital aspects of the ADA until now. So as of just a few weeks ago, the WCAG, WCAG, it's the Web Standards for Accessibility, the group that governs that. This standard is not new, it's been around forever, but they're now saying that legally content must conform to that standard, which is pretty interesting. It currently only applies to Title II companies, which is more or less state agencies and public companies and things like that. Not public, public like government, I guess, government state agencies. Title III is private companies. So for now, it only covers Title II, but again, there's a push to make it cover more broadly, just like the ADA in general, right? We don't carve out exceptions for who has to build wheelchair ramps. It just applies to everyone. So I think probably we're headed in that direction. So it's a good thing to be aware of now, even if it doesn't directly affect you today. The compliance deadline is a few years out because it is a really big change. But again, if you happen to work for a state agency or someone like that, you should know about this. So to spotlight a technical standard, which is interesting, there's a standard around CSS called @scope. And interestingly, the concept of this has been around for a long time, for many years. And there was a kind of a different implementation in some browsers early on that got axed, but it's kind of come back around. And it's basically this idea of being able to target specific areas of the DOM subtree, but in a way that's a little more generic than using the types of selectors that we have today. This is the format of it. So you basically declare a scope. You can almost think of it a little bit like scopes in maybe other languages that you've used, where you're declaring sort of an area within the DOM that applies to your rules, essentially. So just as an example of what that means, let's say we have a DOM structure that looks kind of like this, and you want to target images that are within this area of your document. Well, we can do that today, right? If you've written any CSS, there's a million ways you could target that thing. A really common way would be to use child selectors, for example. And the idea is like, say we want to exclude these, but target these, right? So you have to select down into that part of the DOM. And that works, but it has some drawbacks. So using @scope, what you can do is declare that between, actually the to part is optional. So you can just say starting at this and below, or you can say starting at this selector and ending at this selector, create a scope within which the CSS rules that you write apply. So again, if we go back, oh, sorry, not that back, that back. If we look at this markup again, if we want to select everything in between article body and figure, but exclude everything out of it, we're basically creating a scope from here to here. So that's essentially what this does. And the nice thing about it is it's less coupled to the DOM. So with our very specific selectors, if the intermediate DOM changed in some way, right, we added or removed something that changed the hierarchy, that would actually break the previous selector. Here, it's a little more flexible to changes. It's also easier to override. So if you've done any CSS, I'm sure you've run into the need to, move a style in line or use an bang important or, various things that we have to kind of override really specific styles. Well, here it's a lot easier because they're sort of designed to be overridable kind of out of the box. It's also easier to nest. So you can actually nest scopes within scopes, and it kind of works exactly the way you would expect. And then a really cool feature of it is that you can apply them locally via style blocks like this. So this essentially accomplishes the same thing where you're implicitly scoping this CSS to the containing root node. So basically everything within article body that is an image will get this, and everything outside of it will not. And this is really nice because in addition to the advantages I just mentioned, it also provides really nice locality, which is often advantageous, especially when you think about, say, writing components that you might want to be portable. The downside is it's not quite fully available. Firefox is the holdout, although as of just a month ago, they've put it on their roadmap. So that should be coming out soon. The nice thing now that we have evergreen browsers is that basically once this group supports something, it's more or less good to go, unless, unfortunately, if you still have to support old IE, then I feel sorry for you. But hopefully most of us don't have to do that these days. And then speaking of that, the Popover API is one that came out that actually is fully supported. Again, now that Firefox, which was the holdout, now that they've added support for it, it is fully available. And it's basically what it sounds like. So a popover is, there's tons of libraries that do that. You can create tooltips and dialogues and things, anything that sort of pops up out of the DOM. And just to show you as an example, the thing that's really cool about this is you can see that this creates a little kind of modal style popover thing. But the amazing thing about it, if you look on the right, the JS pane is completely empty. There's no JavaScript involved in making this thing work. Now, obviously, you can connect to it from JavaScript to add what you want to it, but just to make it functionally work is 2 lines of HTML. That's it. And then optionally some styling to make it look nice. That's pretty cool. And that's available today in all the evergreen browsers. So odds are you could actually probably remove a library that you might be using that does that kind of stuff. And then happy belated JS Naked Day. Anyone hear about JS Naked Day? So this is a pseudo holiday that someone came up with. April 24th, so we just missed it. It was yesterday. But they claim that the web should work without JavaScript. So this is the day of the year where we're supposed to celebrate the good old days of the web when pages actually rendered from HTML. It's named after HTTP 424, which is failed dependency. So that's where 424, April 24th comes from. So basically from 0 o'clock to 0 o'clock, spanning all time zones, is roughly 50 hours. So they want you to remove JS, and it promotes the rule of least power, which is actually something I did not know about, but it's an old school web thing. As you can see, this was actually written or edited by Tim Berners-Lee. And this talks about that they're advocating basically using the least powerful language suitable for expressing information on the web. So we've kind of gotten away from that, right? The starting point now for most new developers is, npm install React, whatever, create React app, right? And that's kind of like a lot of people's entry point into building web software. But it doesn't have to be like that, right? We could go back to simpler times. So that's what this holiday is supposed to represent. And last but not least, there is a technical angle to this, which I'll get to in a moment. But some of you may have seen the headlines recently. Voyager 1, and there's Voyager 2 as well, but Voyager 1 launched back in 1977. This image is from the NASA website where they have a little dashboard where you can check on its status at any time, which is really cool. But this image is the current point of view from Voyager pointing back at our solar system. So this is the entirety of our solar system in that image, including various comets and things outside of like Pluto even. And it all fits there within a few hundred pixels on my monitor. So that's pretty amazing. Some perspective is the title of the section. Some quick stats. So this thing has been flying for 46 years. It's currently 15 billion miles from Earth. And it's currently traveling around 38,000 miles per hour. That's estimated velocity relative to the sun, if you're an astrophysics nerd. So the news is that back in November, Voyager 1 stopped communicating. It was basically just sending random ones and zeros, and they weren't sure why. Turns out the flight data system had become corrupted, most likely a stray cosmic ray or something probably fried it. And so the way that they had to debug it was by basically sending poke commands. And so they basically didn't know which part of the thing was broken. So they said, okay, I'm going to take this one little section of this one component and I'm going to poke it and I'm going to see if I get back a response that's meaningful, right? Voyager is so far away that it takes 22.5 hours one way to send a message, and then another 22.5 hours to receive the response. So they've been working on that since November, and last weekend they finally figured out what the problem was and got it working. So they don't have it fully working yet, but they have it figured out basically, and they're in the process now of getting it fully working. And the long story short is the way that they're going to fix it is that the component that's broken, they have to take the code that was in that component and redistribute it to other components that are still working. Well, it turns out that code is too big to fit in any other one component. So they're splitting that code up into smaller pieces that they're then distributing across the memory of the Voyager and then connecting them back so that they still work as one unit. So wrap your head around that for a second. This is the part I was just talking about. So they split up the code, relocated it in chunks in various parts. And by the way, the overall memory of this thing was like 64K. So this is the limitations that they're dealing with. They did that and are still doing it, actually. They're still working on this at 45 hours per command, right? They send a command and wait and get a response. So the perspective is that next time you're frustrated because your, React component isn't quite aligned or your TypeScript annotation isn't quite compiling, right? There's some JPL engineer out there that has a much harder time than you in terms of debugging. So just appreciate that. With that, that's all I got. So I appreciate it. I'm going to turn it over to Ted for lightning talk. And then we'll have Dave come up.
Okay, my name's Ted. We ended up doing a lot of AI work around basically LLMs and embeddings. And what I wanted to show you was AWS launched a service, I believe it's about 6 to 8 months ago, called Bedrock. And essentially it's an app store for third-party companies to publish models into an AWS account. Kind of show you what that looks like. But they have quite a few providers. The list is expanding. You can actually run a version of Meta's new Llama 3 on this or any of the Mixtral models. They're also working on training them, but most handily, like we end up using Anthropic a lot and we use Cohere for our embedding APIs. And I just wanted to show you what that was like. So essentially, if you hop into embeddings, an embedding takes the textual term and translates it into an array. And the array has a length or width depending on what the embedding model is. So embeddings simply just say, you say cat and it says giant array of floating point numbers. And then in that array is actually the meaning that is pulled out of the embedding model. So it actually goes from this is the word cat to the meaning of cat in that embedding model. And when you do that, you get some very interesting things because you can actually search on array vectors faster than you can search on keywords. And the array vectors allow you to do cosine distance, so you can measure the distance between cat and dog as terms, or you could actually take the embedding of an entire document and compare that document to a bunch of other documents, and through search, you can basically narrow down which ones get hit. So to create an embedding with Bedrock, you essentially use the standard AWS SDK. So here I have Python, I have Boto installed. I'm just using standard Boto 3. Let me blow this up just a little bit. All right. One more. So effectively, I create a client, and then I basically, and then I just create a function. This is actually the call to this is the call to get the embedding. So we're simply putting in an array of texts that text goes to what is effectively a serverless, there's servers behind it, but a serverless API. And that API just returns data to me. And then basically AWS bills us for the usage of those APIs. So in this particular case, I get back an embedding vector from the response, and it's basically a JSON object with the embedding in it. And I go ahead and basically convert that back to JSON. So I'm turning it back into native objects because the API is returning JSON. And then here I get the embedding for a cat, for a dog, and for a frog. And then I'm actually going to print one out. So I'm going to show you what the embedding actually looks like. And then the dimensions of embedding vectors are simply how many items are in the embedding array. Think of it as like column width. But dimensions are like we know 2D and 3D, that's 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. The dimensions coming out of this are 1024. So it has all different values to sort different features depending on what the AI model generated. And again, that's in the embedding. And then I'm gonna actually just do the cosine similarity between cat and dog and between cat and frog. You'll actually be able to see, it actually makes sense why the numbers are split the way they are. And then basically just run it. So, put this up more. And so it's actually sending the array. This is the embedding vector. That is one embedding vector. And so you get into real mathy stuff real fast. But GPUs, the why behind AI and GPUs are they have to process billions of those arrays to try to compare things to other things. And they're using those weights and training to basically do higher level things. In LLMs, they're generating words. But in embedding vectors, you can use these. You can actually load these into a search engine. There are actually lots of vector search. And you can actually search across those documents. And we're searching, we probably in our test database or our test search engine, we basically have about 8,000 search points. That searches inside of milliseconds. It is so fast to get data back. And all it's doing is doing cosine similarity and then ranking those values based on the embedding we asked it to compare. So you can kind of take a phrase and then compare it against each. So that's the basics of doing embeddings. The more fun one is actually the LLMs, which has kind of captured everyone's imagination in the past 6 to 9 months. But in this particular case, I wrote a small app that generates emails. So it generates email bodies and subjects depending on what you prompt it to enter. And this one gets a little bit interesting. So same client, you're just going to call the function in a different way. And in this case, we're going to basically call the function LLM. We're going to pass it a prompt, and that prompt is going to be sent to the service. We're going to return the data. And so in this case, we're calling the Anthropic API. This one is, I believe it's Haiku 2 or Haiku, no, Sonnet. It's Claude 3 Sonnet is the API. And the prompt is, you're a professional email writer. Return a fully formed email based on the details provided. And then in the messages, I simply add the user's prompt. So I'm conditioning the model to basically say, reply to these conditions, and then I put in a system prompt to basically get very specific results back. And then I sort of set the temperature high because I want this thing to be more creative instead of more direct and kind of focused. And 0.5 is like 80. But then I just put it in a repel loop, and we basically just do this nonstop. So we can generate all sorts of emails. Okay, so here's where it gets interesting. And submit to Qmity. And so you can give it just a little bit of context. And what effectively happens is that chain of words gets turned into embedding vectors, queries the LLM, and then the LLM returns this response. It writes a pretty reasonable email based on the data that that model's been trained on. I could have it generate endless emails here, and I've done it in loops. But it's fascinating because you can have AIs do creative work and return that data to you. You can also have those same APIs return JSON and data structures. We found, actually, we use this model a lot. And one of the things that we've kind of discovered is it has a really nice context window, and it understands that if you push something into it, you can actually extract that data. So it's probably the best parser I think I've ever seen. It can parse really, really crazy things, like shove a PDF in, and it will give you back structured JSON that represents the document. So there's a lot of really powerful things in these APIs. And I think if I had to express anything, there are lots of models beyond the classic LLMs. And as those arrive in market, there's going to be pretty interesting things. There's already good ones for doing translation, doing summarization. We're now seeing some doing sentiment, also seeing some commit code. But again, it's an interesting time. That's probably first inning of another long phase. Anyway, thank you.
There you go. Share my screen. Well, that's half the challenge. Figure that out. Share. Sure. There we go. Say this is good enough. Sounds bad me. All right, we're good. All right. All right, here we go. Hi, I'm Dave Rupert. Today we're talking about HTML Super. I'm Dave Rupert. I'm based in Austin, Texas. I went to UT, go from Horns. They let me major in Japanese. I don't know why. I'm still bitter about it. They kind of just took my money, but whatever. I don't know. I'm co-founder of a startup called Luro. It helps you with your components, not just web components, any kind of components, kind of understanding your design system, and as it kind of goes out to like your whole entire product. Co-host of the Shop Talk Show with Chris Coyer of CSS Tricks, formerly, I guess, of CSS Tricks. And he does CodePen, which we saw earlier. And I'm in the W3C. Just kidding, I'm in the W3C web components group, but not even like the real one that works on web components. I'm just part of the community group. And I'm not like a president or a chair or anything. I'm just a member. So like anyone can be a member. So we have a Discord. It's pretty cool. So anyway, so that's my authority on web components today. I'm just going to give who's heard of web components? We'll start there. Okay. Yeah. Everyone's heard about it. That's great. Okay. So this is the boring webcomponents.org website that is like in a weird state. It's not been updated for many years, but anyway, because I think Google owns it, but they don't want to maintain it, but that's fine. But web components are a set of web platform APIs that allow you to create new custom reusable encapsulated HTML tags to use in web pages and web apps, right? So the key word is encapsulated, and that's going to be like the big one that will rock your brain. So I'm just going to highlight that one because we'll probably hear it a few thousand times in this presentation. But just to break it down, like web components are Lego, right? And like this is not a new metaphor by any means, right? Like we've been doing component systems for God, how long, right? Well, let me tell you exactly how long. We've been doing them since about 2005. Dojo did it first, of course, and then jQuery and jQuery UI kind of came out, and then YUI was there, and then EXTJS. There it is. EXTJS was so cool. I just like wasn't smart enough to use it. You know what I mean? It was just like so cool. I wasn't smart enough to use it. But then Angular came around and started kind of changing how we think about kind of component systems and frameworks and things like that. Bootstrap, not exactly a JavaScript component system, but more like a CSS component system, and that's still in use today. Ember, I'd be amiss if we didn't put our little hamster buddy on there. React actually was, if you watch the documentary, who's watched the documentary? I did. So, oh boy, I'm in deep. It was actually 2011, but the first production one wasn't until 2013. And then even that one shipped with this weird license where if you used it, you couldn't sue Facebook and something like that. So cool if you used it before that. You must have a very nice manager. But then Vue came out, Evan You made Vue, and then Svelte came out. And then, so where do web components sit on this grand timeline of things? Well, they're actually kind of in this era, right in the middle. So 2011-ish was sort of the first V0. Google kind of said, we're making this, and then they yeeted it into Chrome, and then everyone was like, wait, what's this? So, but what makes web components unique? We have component systems. What makes them unique? Well, what makes them unique is it's actually a set of web standards. You didn't see that animation coming. That surprised you. So what are these web standards? Well, it's for native web technologies, right? So there's an HTML template, which is actually a pretty cool element that has its own superpowers in itself. It's sort of like a script tag that you can put inert HTML in, and then the browser will pre-process that. And so it's gets it all tokenized and cached and in its memory, however browsers do that. And then you just say, hey, clone that template you already know about. So pretty cool. There's also this other element called slot. We'll kind of get into it, but that's how you get element or your actual content into a web component. Custom elements are the big flagship feature. This is how you get your own element with a hyphen. It has to have a hyphen. That's one limitation. This is how you get your element into, I don't know, you could have it be Dave's map, or I'm at Expedia, so it's Dave Hotel, right? So it's I can make my own custom element with my own branding on the front and ship it, out to either internal consumers or external consumers. The next one is Shadow DOM, and this is it's called Shadow DOM, but it's a really opaque term to me, but I think of it as encapsulation. So your component is an egg, right? And then you have world stuff on the outside and egg stuff on the inside, and you don't want the egg stuff on the inside going out, and you don't want the other stuff going into the egg, right? That's encapsulation. So the model for web components is kind of a strict form of encapsulation, and there's ways around it. There's different modes, but it's sort of this idea of no, this is sort of almost like an HTML element, to be honest, how you can't mess with the file input text. Why? But it's just like that. So you can't futz around with what's inside of it. And then the last one is HTML imports, which were killed by Mozilla on December 15, 2014. And no, I'm not still bitter about it, but I am. So good luck, Mozilla. I hope you enjoy rotting. No. This isn't going on the web, is it? No. I think that's a major mistake. Anyway, HTML inputs were awesome, but now we use ES modules, right? That has all gained adoption. So everything's kind of moved from this very HTML-centric component system to more JavaScript-centric systems. And there's a lot kind of evolving with that space too. Great, but is anyone actually using this? Yeah, that's what everyone says. I was literally in a conversation today. It was no one's using web components. It's yeah, well, some companies are, If you need to take a photo of this slide and send it to your boss, you can totally do that. Yeah, just small little software company out of San Francisco, this goggle, little software startup out of Washington, some banks, some software companies, different small companies. We don't know who these are, but they're using web components to a big degree. Even Photoshop for web, if you use that, I used that recently to extend a photo, do their generative AI thing, and it's built with web components. Photoshop is built with web components. There's been a big adoption. There's actually, if I Googled the new version of this chart, and kind of took a dip, so I don't know what happened. Maybe GitHub switching to React affected this, but like there's been a steady increase in the adoption of web components to the point that like 1 out of every 5 web pages you load or that get loaded in Chrome have a web. And is like 1 billion% of that YouTube? Yeah, 1 billion% of that's YouTube. But the adoption is growing over time. But probably the biggest breakout success for web components is Wordle, acquired for 7 figures by the New York Times, was written with web components. So what idea are you sitting on that's worth 7 figures if you just read it in web? If they're so great, why am I not using them? Yeah, no, that's a good question. I have strong opinions here. Like, first of all, they were designed way too low level. Like it's like, I don't know. Imagine if like your Legos were like, I don't know, like just the metal presses that you use to make Legos. You would be like, this is not fun, right? Like, and you had to like inject your own plastic into it to like play with Legos. Less fun, right? Marketing problems from heavy-handed advocacy. A lot of Google folks were like, you are stupid and you need to use web components. And that didn't go over well, right? Like that's so wild. And then like people who, they were designed for like these framework authors, but then none of them like picked it up, right? And it's hard to invest in something unknown. If you didn't know about Wordle, you would never invest in web components. It'd be hard for you to like say to your manager, we should use web components. And they're like, who's using them? And you're like, I don't know. No one. It's hard to like, without like a success story, no one would use React if it wasn't for Facebook or Instagram. And it wasn't truly supported until very recently. I say recently, but like, the first version shipped in 2011, right? That's what I had on my thing. And then it was, I think 2016, Safari got a half implemented version of it. 2018, Firefox gets it. Edge doesn't get it until 2020 when they switched to Chrome. So like, if you were using web components before 2020, you were like on the bleeding edge, atx.com. And I get paid every time I say that. But you were on the bleeding edge, right? And so you didn't get, you had all the cuts and bruises from using them and trying to support Edge and IE and things like that. So there's probably more, but what I like to say is, because we're in Texas, I can say this, it's slow like brisket, right? Web components are always going to be slower than hot new framework JS. It's because they're built on web standards. And part of that is going to be super frustrating because you wait 2 years for a feature to come out or 10 years. But that slowness is what makes it a stable foundation to build on. And hopefully you can find a user land solution that works and polyfills it in the meanwhile. But it becomes a stable foundation. I'm kind of stuck in a Vue 2 to Vue 3 migration. Anyone else stuck in one of those? Yeah, it's not rad. It's not fun. Who's stuck in a React migration? Yeah. Are you on server components yet? No? Yeah, right? Like migrating a framework and stuff like that is going to hurt. And the promise or the idea of web components is that it's going to be less hurt because like not much changed since the last time you looked at your code. And this goes into this talk by Jeremy Keith called Building. He has this really great talk where it takes this idea of pacing layers from Stuart Brand's sort of how buildings grow or something like that. But it's this whole idea of just this, nature moves slower than culture, right? And culture moves slower than governance, and governance moves slower than infrastructure, and infrastructure moves slower than commerce, and then fashion moves all Jeremy all over the place, right? It's just all squirrely and things like that. But you take that to the web, we have a kind of a similar thing, right? Like hopefully TCP IP doesn't change. That would really change a few things on the internet. HTTP, probably not changing, although we use HTTPS now. URLs, well, URLs don't change, right? But they will if you work in the enterprise. And then HTML moves a little fast. kind of like a 5-10 year scale. And then CSS has actually been super hot lately. If you're not paying attention, we saw a bunch of CSS. And then JavaScript is still just like, whoa, check this out, every week. So I think this is a really great framework for talking about web components, because these are actually all built into a web component. A web component is these three things. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's look at using HTML components with HTML. Yeah, I've been frustrated with the modern state of web development. Sometimes it feels like you just want to write some HTML and CSS and you got all these god dang problems in the way, right? You just want to make a freaking website. You got all this stuff jamming you up. Well, my assertion is web components bring us closer to writing HTML. That feeling, right? That kind of declarative, super declarative feeling of writing HTML. Anyone seen one of these websites where it's kind of this like before after photo, and journalism uses a lot? I love these. Like these like are very impactful for me. I like look at every single pixel and see every sort of, usually it's around destruction, hurricanes, wars, and tsunamis in this case. It's a really evocative form of storytelling. But I never want to code one of these. Like, touch events, pointer events, absolutely positioned images. Nope, I'm out. Don't want to do that. Well, thankfully, web components have us covered. There's this one called 2UP. There's a few iterations of this, but this is 2UP, and it's from Chrome Labs. Google Chrome made this and use it in a few things. I think they actually use it in Squoosh, if you've ever used Squoosh app to minify your images. When you like before and after. It's really cool. And the API is just like this. I take my custom element 2UP and I put a div to get the block, and then I put an image, and then I put the image, add some alt text, of course, but then I just have then link to a script tag, and bingo bango, I get this, my own custom slider. I didn't do anything. I just put it on the page. So that feels good to me. And there's like ways to like style this, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later, but this is kind of just a really cool feature just for like, I don't know, like if somebody asked you to like code this 2UP thing, you wouldn't have to be like, let me npm install and hope this goes well, in your life work, right? An alert component for your office, right? Like, so we have an alert, we have an icon that says, oh, it's a note, and then there's an alert message, and then we have a button to close it, right? But I can like do this HTML. I can send this HTML to you in Slack, but then you're gonna have to like figure out all the JavaScript, bind all the events, pile in all the CSS, put it in your application. What if there was an easier way? Yeah, there is with web components. So we can get an API that's more like this, a little more declarative, a little less like manually wiring everything. And so I have like a custom alert, and then I say what icon I want to show up there, and then I have the alert message, and then I close the tag. And then I have just link it up, and then that handles all the like closing, and we get something like this, right? That's pretty cool. Like that's kind of what we want. If you work with like, I don't know, maybe you trust everybody on your team to get it right. But I have been in experiences where less detail-oriented people are writing code, and they sort of like miss some of the, binding click events sort of nuances of the component. And so like this ends up being a really great way to deliver code internally to your team or externally to other people. What's going on behind the scenes is it's taking this, custom element, and then what we're doing is we're like injecting some shadow DOM, right? And that's what's inside the red outline there. And that shadow DOM has our note icon. It has the slot element, and I'll explain that. And then it has our button to close with all the functionality hooked up. But that slot element basically says like, I'm going to take this content and I'm going to slot it into the shadow DOM. I'm going to take this light. So shadow DOM implies the existence of light DOM. And so we take that light DOM and we reveal it inside the shadow DOM. Wow. Okay. But just kind of do a mental picture. DevTools actually helps you out to like, it shows like what's being revealed where, but you basically just imagine it kind of sliding into And you can have more than just one slot. That's a neat thing too. You can have name slots. So you can have like 10, 15, 20 different slots that you just have like 20 different pieces of content that you just slot into the right place. So, all right. So my next assertion is that web components are great for recipes. So we kind of saw that like that alert message gets upgraded into like a closable, dismissible alert, right? Well, I've got big opinions on podcast players. I have a podcast with Chris Coyer. We've done over 600 episodes, but here's my big thesis on podcast editors or players. Like they need a 1x, 2x button, right? Got to have multiple speeds. I'm on 2x all the time. And then they need to have forward and back, like 30-second rewind, 10, 15 seconds. Because like when you're listening to a podcast and somebody said something good, but it was going too fast because you listened too fast, you need to hit that back button to go back to hear it again, right? So I'm pretty opinionated about that. But when you play it in the normal like HTML player, the HTML audio element, womp womp, like it has play. Like you hit the shish kebab menu and you can get like a whatever, like you can get playback speed now. It's like a new feature they invented, but you can get playback speed. But it's just not, doesn't have the ethos, right? Like, wouldn't it be cooler if I could just wrap my audio element in a podcast player element and then link up my thing, my script, and then bingo bango, I get something like this. And then it's going to be a little hard to see, but under the hood, a bunch of different, shadow DOM is being injected in that component to make that play, and then actually hide the the actual audio element, and then or just remove the controls attribute. And then I can just trigger play on the audio. It's pretty cool. And we're actually using this on the Shop Talk site. If you go there, you see you're using a web component. So it's pretty cool. It's fun. And it's, yeah. Another one I recommend is Details Utils from Zach Leatherman. It's there's who's played with the details element? Pretty cool, right? It's like a disclosure element. It's like a label, and you click it and it has like a drop down. You're like, dude, a drop down in HTML. This is, I'm making an accordion. I'm making everything's going to be this, start building menus. And then you read this post by Adrian Roselli. That's like, details summary are not a menu. And you're like, what? Well, a menu has like some other functionality, like an escape button, right? Or like when you mouse out or whatever, click outside of it, it should close, right? That stinks, but that's where Details Utils comes in. And then through like a few attributes, like just popping on some attributes, then we can get the close, escape, and animate. If you've ever tried to animate a details element, you've lost like months of your life. For some reason, it just doesn't work, but this helps you, it figures it out and does it for you. And then you get something that works. So what's cool about that is like, that makes our websites like, I don't know, more maintainable, but I think web components are going to help us make simpler, more accessible, and more maintainable websites. Like that just little bit of accessibility where you have like a click outside to close and like that just works. That's great, because I probably won't implement that unless somebody tells me to. Wait, are you saying like this would allow us to create and share accessible pre-built components without the need for specific JavaScript frameworks and overly complicated build processes? Yeah, I am. That's the vision, right? That's the vision. Like, let's get rid of all this stuff. Let's just have a bucket of Legos to play with. One of my bucket of Legos is called generic components, and it is generic components, generic looking components. And it's all coded to the Y ARIA authoring practices guide and by Pascal Schilp, who does the generic components. And it's pretty cool. I mean, I would kind of start here unless I needed something different, something more stylish. What's cool about this is I actually got to use this. Here's like how it works. So it's like generic tabs, and then you have a button. You have a button that then activates the tab panel and the panel, and then we're using name slots to slot those all in the right place. It works pretty good. I use this when I was working working with OpenUI, which is a group of people on the internet who are trying to standardize a bunch of these UI components and make proposals and maybe get things in the web platform. Like the Popover API was incubated here. I was in calls on that. I didn't work on that really specifically, but I was working on something called the Tab Vengers team. And we were working to try to get a native HTML tabs element in HTML. And so what we started with was this idea of spicy sections, right? And so we made a web component called spicy section, right? And so the idea with spicy sections was you kind of start with just normal ass content, H2s and text and H2s and text, and then it could like fold up into an accordion on mobile, because that makes more sense than like 700 tabs laid out, right? And so like it's an accordion on mobile, it's like regular content on that weird tablet you own, the Samsung Galaxy 9, and then it's the spicy, and then turns into the tabs at the desktop. This didn't make it. It failed. That's okay, because what's cool is it gave us something to talk about inside OpenUI. And what's cool is when you make a web component and you're talking to somebody who works on Chrome and they say, yeah, we could make that. That's a pretty good feeling. Like it ultimately like doesn't have the right ARIA, and this whole like mighty morphin power element thing doesn't work from an accessibility standpoint. So that's cool. Let's take a step back. But one thing they did take from this is now you can stack a bunch of details and give them all the same name attribute, and it'll work like in a single panel accordion. So that's cool. Good on OpenUI. But my next hypothesis is web components will take us to their gateway to a new dimension, right? Who bought a Apple Vision Pro? Did you return it? No, you still have it. Oh, amazing. I wish I could see it right now. Imagine me, goggles on. So there's this custom element called Model Viewer. And I think this is a Chrome element, if I'm not mistaken. But it's from Google. So it basically, you just load up an image and then you get this little model. And then you can even do the little AR thing where you make a dinosaur in your living room, and kids are like, yeah, that's cool, So this can do all that. And it's just, and the API is like, just use a script tag and then set it up like an image with a source that points to a model. And then you have an alt attribute, some rotate attributes, and some camera controls. And there might be a AR thing too that you use to get the whole AR feature. Pretty cool. We had 3D in our, just with the one element. And I took a spin. I was like, I'm going to see how this goes, see if I can push the limits. And so I made a Lizard Wizard website, and Lizard Wizard's cool. And it's on like a gradient background. I was just trying to see if like I could break it, right? I put it over a web font and I thought, surely that's going to crash it. But no, there's a little flash of, white there, I think as the model loads, but it's kind of cool. And I was kind of like, man, this could give some like cool depth to like a website that, without much effort, right? Like if you want like, we're at Expedia, so we're getting a 3D spinning globe, right? With some hotels or, Airbnbs or something somewhere. Yeah. So Verbos, sorry. I messed it up. Verbos. The nice ones. Yeah, because the Airbnbs are the dump holes. And yeah, it's just a couch in some guy's heroin room. And the Verbos are the nice one with the beaches. Everybody knows that. All right. I know you're saying, Dave. Let's go further. Let's go full immersion. I got you. We're going. There's this great library from Mozilla VR, which RIP doesn't exist anymore, but the people are still working on it. So that's good. Called A-Frame. And what's cool about A-Frame is you basically link to a script thing that gives you some elements. And you have a very declarative API to say, I want a scene. I know, stop me if this gets too confusing. And in a scene, I want a sphere, and I want a box, and I want a cylinder, and I want a plane, like a two-dimensional plane, not an airplane, that would be cool. And then I want a sky, which is actually just a big circle, but the inside of the circle is colored. I didn't know that, but that's cool. And then you get something like this. A full 3D experience that you can like walk around. If you have the little controllers, you can boop, sixed off around. Pretty cool. Pretty cool experience. And I like how it's kind of like a WASD on like a desktop computer, but then when you go full VR, it goes full VR. I saw an interesting demo of this just yesterday. They like told AI to make me an A-frame scene of a castle, and it made this really just ugly, like this, basically, like castle with some things. And then they got the camera just right. And then they're like, okay, ChatGPT, make this into an image. And then it like took that and then it like made it into a fantasy image from that exact aspect, like where they were like situated with the sun and the moon, everything. Kind of cool. What did I do with it? Oh, I'm glad you asked. I made a whale that dispenses agile advice. So, and it uses the speech synthesis API, and it goes like, avoid distraction, avoid distraction. No. Oh, it's my little life coach. I wake up every morning and talk to the whale and get the mysteries of the universe. I've started collecting some of these in this little repo called Awesome Standalones, just this whole idea of like standalone web components that you can just plop and drop on your page and just make sure, like, I don't know, just like have a good time, have a play. Maybe you don't have to code something this week. Maybe you just use a web component. That would be kind of cool. And I've like even started like making a more like database version of this in Notion, just because it's kind of wild. But anyway, it's just something to have. So summary of what's good about the HTML side of things. Easy as HTML, great reusability. We're using them all over the place. Better experiences, like we can get 3D experiences. We got progressively enhanced components, right? We served regular content and then we enhanced it into a cool alert. We are encapsulated. We don't have styles bleeding in and out of every place. If you set, we didn't see much of that. We'll see more of that in the next section, but and then the next one is buildless. Anyone pick up on that? I didn't use a single build tool. That's pretty cool. Like, think about your job, your life. What was the last problem you had that stopped you for days? It was the build tool. It was the Webpack, right? It hurt. I still can't get Jest to like work with my code editor. I don't know how, but anyway. It's just that stuff. It's those little things like we didn't have to build. And actually that's kind of like an interesting part of web component culture is that it's like the bundling and the splitting and all that is kind of a production level concern. So this is all coordinated web technologies, and there are roll up patterns and things like that for getting all that, but like we haven't done a single build step. So pretty cool. Moving on to CSS. This is not the fun part. So are you ready to take a deep breath? It's going to be a weird one. And the reason it's weird is because it involves this thing called piercing the shadow DOM, which is simultaneously the dumbest and the coolest phrase we have in web. So it is piercing the shadow DOM is hard because like you have this web component, right? And then we have the shadow DOM, right? And that little red line is the shadow boundary, right? And then it can be really confusing because some styles pass through and some don't, and you don't know why. So let's look at why that happens. And I'll say this from like a person who does do CSS a lot. If you don't do CSS a lot, it's probably double confusing and double frustrating. But as somebody who uses CSS, like I am used to having full control. I can like important town my way out of any situation, right? Like I am the boss of the file, right? Like, and so, yeah, so it's frustrating when it does not work in web. So let's do this alert, right? And so like I have this thing. So what's interesting is like the light DOM, right? That little sentence that we passed in, I have a light DOM component on top of it, or sorry, a shadow DOM component on top and a light DOM on the bottom. I can like actually style the light DOM. And that's an interesting principle of web components is if you wrote it, you can style it. That's going to be like my tattoo. It's just like, if you wrote it, you can style it. Ooh, all right, we solved a lot of problems just by knowing, right? But what about that button, right? Ooh, I'd like to style that button, but that's pure shadow. So I tried to do like button pink, and I did button pink important, of course, and that didn't work. But I know what you're thinking. I'm going to get really specific. hit it with a double element, custom alert button background, right? That's the natural thing that you try. Bing, service says it does not work, right? So that stinks. You're mad, you're frustrated. And I got bad news because it gets more confusing. Because some styles do pass through the shadow boundary. Okay, and they're called inheritable styles. And this is a big long list of styles I got off of MDN, but basically you think of it like these styles, like, and it's literally any style that can have the value of inherit. So that's kind of weird, but if you think about it, like anything you'd want an iframe to get, like type information, font size information, things like that. So it looks like it's a member of the page, right? So anything that you think would kind of go into an iframe would go into web. Okay, working with that knowledge, there's actually, we can style, we can set the font family to fantasy and the color to red, and we start getting red, and it starts changing. All that stuff is kind of going through it. It went to that icon that we did, but not that button, not that. All right, but we got the icon, so that feels pretty good. And you know what else is an inheritable style? CSS variables, baby. Nice. So we can use these CSS variables like --bg red purple, the --text white, and we can like pass that into the web component. Now your web component has to be set up to read those and understand those, and there's probably some API that does that. 2UP has this kind of styling API where you can set the accent color and the thumb track size, and you can do this as like to your heart's content, like whatever, however many variables you want to set up here. But that is kind of the primary way, I think, to get some style, some control inside to a web. They're a great way to add that. There's a few more hooks and ways to style custom elements. Like you could have like pre-built themes in your component that, adjust styles inside your web component. And then, you might get something like this, like 3 different themes, and different. So you get like a default, a warning, and then a danger zone, right? I'm still kind of mad about that button though. Didn't get that button. Wouldn't it be nice to get that button? So there's one way to do that. So we have our, it's called name shadow part. So we have our custom element, and then we do the shadow DOM, but then we can have this thing called part. And then we can give it a name, right? Part icon, part button, right? And then we can use this fancy double part CSS thing, and we can put button in there. And that's going to select the button part, just like a pseudo element, like a, I don't know, colon, WebKit range slider or something like that. It's like your own part of the element that you can style. Unfortunately, like you can't do complex selectors inside of that part thing. You can only do like a base level thing, and that's kind of a web component unfortunately. But so that's how you style the button, and we did it. So kind of wrapping your head around what goes through, like kind of knowing that the deep styling story, the full, I guess, open styling does not work now. Might work later, but it doesn't work now. That's something to just wrap your head. All right, who's ready for JavaScript? We can speed run this. All right, we got one. Okay, 1. All right, 2. We have 2. All right, here we go. Writing web components with JavaScript. So every web component has a life cycle, and hopefully you can read this or find a TV near you that you can read this from. But it's basically, there's a few like methods for observing attributes, and you're just saying these are like attributes like pay attention to and fire events if something happens. You have a constructor callback because it's all written in classes, right? This is sort of like how it's sort of the old class-based structure, and you're extending HTML element. And then you have a connected callback, which is like React's old component did mount, a disconnected callback, which is like component will unmount, and an attribute change callback, which is kind of like, okay, a value changed. And then like inside of there, if you had multiple attributes, you'd have to do this big switch statement on how to handle all that and just to reassign the value to the new value. Not the best API. It's not, then you have to register it, and that's like custom elements defined. Not the best API, which is why I would actually not recommend writing vanilla web components. Okay? And part of that is because remember at the beginning of the talk, I said they were designed for framework authors. So they weren't designed for you. This API was not built for you. It was built for super dorks. So you can use like a little shim to make it a little bit better. And that's like a bit like, and there's some really cool like libraries that are only like 5 to 10 kilobytes. So it's not breaking the budget. It's like 1/10 the size of React and React. So whatever, that's no big deal. Maybe 1/20. So the primary one, oh man, this is hard to see, but is Lit, right? Lit element is from Google. It's kind of the successor to the Polymer project. There's a lot of cool things about Lit, but it has kind of like a class like React thing. But what's cool about it is you can get this render function. And inside the render function, you can chuck an HTML template just like JSX. And like you just spit that out and it feels just like you're writing JSX. But you're kind of closer to the HTML metal. And you don't actually go spin up this big dumb VDOM. You don't go do that. It's just all right there in HTML. And then this one's called Hybrids. I don't know too many people who use it, but it's got this cool like svelte-like vibe to it. So if you like, and then there's also this one Stencil from Ionic, which who makes this like, what is it? It's like a mobile development framework. And so Stencil's cool. They're kind of, it's sort of like I don't know, React with decorators, I guess. Class-based React with decorators, or kind of gives me a little bit of like an Angular vibe. It's what's cool about this though is it's designed to transpile to other language or other frameworks. So if you write a stencil component, they kind of say like all you have to do is run a command line and then you get a rack component out of it, or you can use a wrapper or something like that. So we're going to look at Lit, but I just kind of been showing you 3 of like 81 different flavors of web components that are out there that you can use. So a basic component in Lit, we're going to have our HTML, right? Pretty standard little component API, or kind of just whatever code. And then to set up the component, we're doing that same sort of like as the vanilla component, but we're importing Lit element in HTML. And so we're going to extend Lit element instead of HTML element. And then we're going to set up the super and the constructor, and then we're going to do set attributes for our accessibility features that offshore is totally going to miss. And so then we're going to do like go render and return the HTML slot. So that's just going to pass that light DOM into that shadow DOM right there. And so that's all we had to do. Pretty cool. This feels more modern to me, a little less clunky than the normal way. But then we wanted to get some properties in there. So they have a static get properties method that then you pass it an object and you can type some of that stuff. I don't think it's like type check or anything like that, but you know, it kind of just lets you set expectations there. You can render, then we start working on a render function. We pop our SVG that we're going to use for the icons in there. And then we have an SVG that uses the use href to like reference what, you know, ID we're looking for. And then we have the slot and we have the button, but we need to wire up the button. So let's do that. We make a close method, like just a little private thing. And then we add this at click equals, and then we do the like template literal, this close. That's sort of a, I guess it's like taken from Vue or Angular or whatever, like these directives, right? But they put it in, and so that's a feature of Lit. Like that's not normal web components. Normal web components, vanilla web components, you have to do like document query selector, this thing, and or this query selector and find the thing, and then you have to bind the event, then you have to kill the event. So we'll just use this for 5 KB. And then we do CSS, which is like the HTML. I should back it up. That HTML, let me back it up. So that return HTML, and it looks like JSX, that's a tag template literal. And what's cool about that is that has like a few superpowers inside of itself. So it actually references lit HTML, but what's cool is that actually creates that template. The browser is able to parse it, that fragment, and then it's atomic updates inside of it. You're not re-rendering the whole tree when an app, or the whole element when an attribute changes. You're just rendering that little piece that needs to re-render it up. So CSS is sort of the same thing. You can't really play around with this much, but it's basically just a block of CSS that gets scoped by default by the shadow DOM in here. And we have a special few CSS things like host In host, when it's hidden, we display none. And then there's a few more things like host theme danger, we'll make it red. Host theme warm, we'll make it yellow. And then I'm doing the : slotted pseudo selector. And I'm saying whatever's slotted in, that's any element star that's slotted in at the root, because remember, we can't do deep selection here, but any elements that's slotted into the root, chuck it into the middle column of our grid, and that hopefully should get us where we need to go. So we end up with something like this. And so now we have an alert component where anyone can just use a WYSIWYG and hook it up to it and spit out whatever garbage they want to type in there, because that's going to happen. And then that's our basic example. And, you know, I know what you're saying. Dave, I just wrote all my stuff in web components and hot new framework 2024 is out. I want to use it. It's got service side, blah, blah, blah. I know what you're saying. That's fine. Use it. If it supports web components, your web components will work, because web components like don't change. So now you're saying like, Dave, what supports web components? Yeah. Yeah. So, and then you might be asking like, why should I use web components? They look a lot like other JS frameworks, and you'd be right. Like they kind of mimic, right? They mimic kind of what's out there already. So one reason you'd use web components is that they can go to other frameworks, right? Like if you're using web components, you can use them in your Angular app. You can use them in your Vue app. You can use them in your Svelte app. There's one notable holdout here. And then those frameworks can export web components out. Vue has like a little wrapper. Svelte has this cool, like you set an attribute, like a Svelte : options or whatever, and you say tag, my tag or whatever. Angular, I forget what they do. I don't use it much or haven't in a long time, but you know, they can spit out web components as well. I think it's in a wrapper. So yeah, the one notable holdup. There's some good news. It's coming. Web components are rumored to be supported in React 19. This is a GitHub post from 2017 where they said they'd use it. So it's been taking a while. This is a GitHub issue from 2017. And in 2021, they said they'd put it in 19. So it's taking a while, but the core of the problem here, who uses React? Anyone? Yeah, enough people, okay. The thing about React is it treats attributes and properties as the same thing. So like when you spread props, it's like, oh, attribute prop, oh yeah, that's all the same thing. In HTML, those are different. Like an attribute like aria pressed and an attribute or a property like, I don't know, what's a good HTML property? Value or something. I guess value is probably a bad example. But anyways, so like properties in HTML act and behave a little differently. They're kind of different things. So that's sort of been the holdup. Thankfully, there are libraries that like in Lit Labs has a like React wrapper where you can wrap your React components and use them, and maybe wrap your web components and use them in React, vice versa. So there's kind of some cool opportunities there if like that's your situation. So web components go to places, but they don't just go to the JavaScript apps, right? You know, you look at this list of companies, these big companies, they're not all shipping React 19, you know, out the door. You know, it's a little bit different story there, right? They're not shipping those apps, they're shipping these apps, right? They got the Java app, the legacy .NET app, a old Ruby on Rails app. They maybe have a Svelte app that some intern made, and then they have the React app, the Angular app, the Vue app, the 11D blog, the WordPress blog that marketing uses, and then like the old Drupal blog that you have to use for, I don't know, interstate compliance or something. So like that's the enterprise life over there. And like you have teams that are highly autonomous get to choose whatever technology they want, and then you have like no shared code between teams. So that's where a good place for web components to hook in. And I think that's where those companies are finding value is, hey, it doesn't matter what you're using like whatever stack, you can use our web components in that stack. So, and a little FAQ rapid fire before we close this out. IE 11, I hope you are not dying on this rusty sword, but there is a wrapper that, or a polyfill for it, but I don't know, man. I don't know if, good luck out there, you know? You probably have other problems that are not web components. SEO, you know, Google, and I think Bing, can flatten the shadow DOM and light DOM into like a cohesive, document. And so, that's cool. So I think like it gives me a lot of, confidence that that would work. This is from their Search Central. Accessibility, you know, there's two things about accessibility. Forms are weird because if you have a label outside the element and you have a input inside the element, like that can't cross that shadow bound. You can't say label for my input when my input doesn't know about the parent document at all. So there's, you know, you could cheat or like fix it by putting the label inside the custom element. That's one way, but it's a problem. And so it is being worked on and hopefully there's a fix. Like I think it's on the interop schedule for this year. So hopefully we get some fixes this year or something like that. But just know like that's a foot gun, like labeling form elements, also returning focus. Like if you open a modal and then you say like, okay, we're going to close it and like go back to where you were. Well, that web component has no idea where it was. Like it was, you know, it's a different encapsulated environment. So you're going to have to do a little bit of work to like track to where it goes back, right? And so focus management is hard in general, and it's hard in web components is kind of what I want to say. So, you know, so just some things to be aware of, that cross-route ARIA, and then like focus management, kind of tough. There's a good blog on it. Redux, SSR, all the other stuff. Yeah, there's a few community protocols, and this actually is, if you saw that new Signals API that got proposed, it's a TC39 stage 0 spec, so don't use it, but it's like some of the people who worked on this proposal and who worked inside that web components community group I'm a part of, they kind of have put together a Signals proposal based on, you know, React and Angular signals and Solid signals, right? Solid has the signals. And then, so it looks great. It seems awesome, and it'd be cool to have like a native state management. But right now it's kind of bring your own and figure out what you're going to use. I would probably start pushing towards a signals thing. Preact, there's a signals library for lit as well. So that's like another reason you use a web component library. The community stuff is going to be real good. And then SSR for like SSRing your components. There's a thing called declarative shadow DOM, which is a big mouthful, but it basically allows you to ship a template inside your element, almost like light DOM, but you ship a template element with the shadow root mode equals open. And then the browser can actually render that before it mounts JavaScript. So that's kind of cool. So there's a way to like render web components before the JavaScript even comes in, and progressive enhancement works in that scenario. So a few big ideas before we're done. Web components build into the web platform, right? You're not building into Zuckerberg's platform. You're not building into Google's platform, although at one point you maybe were. You're not building into Elon's platform. You're building into the web platform. That's something everyone can use. It's good for creating accessible custom elements, and that provides a pathway forward to more better native elements like tabs, accordions, select menus, list boxes, things like that. And some of these are coming out. There's like going to be like popovers, and it's turning also, there's going to be like a way to kind of do these things natively in HTML. So that's cool. And then I speak from firsthand experience. When you show somebody, a browser person, a web component, they say like, wow, you know, this seems like something we can do. And that's what we've been working on in OpenUI, kind of making sense of all these components that all these design systems and all these component systems are shipping, kind of putting that into the browser. And if we got all this stuff in the browser and we're making web components that don't require any build steps, that lowers the complexity, that's less gatekeeping, and it's a way for everyone to get involved a lot easier without this master knowledge of the command line. And that makes it a web for everyone. And that's what I'm looking forward too. But last but not least, ways that you can give me money. I really appreciate that. No, I have a course about this on frontendmasters.com. I'm getting a little bit more into it, a little more practical than this talk. You can read the guidebook, HTML with Superpowers.netlify.net app or something. And you can just take the course book if you want to read through all this stuff I just kind of said, but then it gets into some examples and stuff like that. And then if you want to sign up for Luro, you totally can. So we accept luroapp.com and we'll track your components for you. So thanks. And I'm David Tron 5000 on the internet. Mostly on Mastodon. Thank you. No hard ones. Got one. Question about performance and benchmark. Yes. So the question is one of the downsides to web components, the performance compared to using a framework? No. Web components are going to be like smaller on average. Like that shim is, that library is only 5 kilobytes or something like that. Where web components are slow right now is that they are client side only. And so you get a lot of performance gains when you server render. You know, in React, that's handled by React Render String or your Next.js account. So that is what makes those fast. You can use the declarative shadow DOM and get a similar effect where that is going to be faster. But one nice thing about web components is generally the styling, generally the in even just that life cycle, that component's life cycle, that's hitting C binaries in the browser, is going to be pretty fast. So I think on average, they're smaller, more memory efficient, and that's also why some large. Did I answer your question? And you know, I should probably like back that up with some big data. I don't necessarily have that, but I can look. Know somebody in the back. HTMX, okay. Oh, you did, okay. Yeah, HTMX is a good question. Yeah, how different is it from HTMX? HTMX is cool. Like it's basically like you just use attributes to kind of like invoke methods that then go out and do stuff and then return HTML, whether it's a snippet or a big thing. And then you like, it does the deltas to like fix it and sneak it in there. Like that's cool. And I think like that's a really good paradigm for a lot of people. Like you're like a Go developer or a Ruby developer. If you're a Ruby developer, you're probably familiar with like, what is it? Hotwired turbo. Yeah. Like this has been a concept for like many, many years in web development, like in Ruby land. It's good. It works. It can be slow at times, depending on like if that document coming back is a whole entire document, you know, and then the browser or the framework, I guess HTMX in this case, has to go like, oh, what do I do with all this? Let me figure out the deltas, resolve that, inject that, replace that HTML. And I think web components are a bit more like almost, you know, kind of like these like small islands on your app, on your page. If you think of like the islands architecture, which is Katie Saylor Miller, the islands architecture, it's kind of really a way to think about rather than, you know, I can like make this whole thing a playground and do whatever I want, and it's not going to pollute any other components on the page. Whereas like HTMX, I guess in theory, maybe I'm wrong, but I could like invoke something and then change the header, right? So like you're getting into kind of like, territory. Great power comes great responsibility. But here's what I'd say about HTMX. use that. If you want to go, don't make your own. Like, don't make Dave MX, which is like, I'm just gonna riff, and try to inject HTML everywhere. They've like thought of a lot of things. So I think it's cool, but I don't use it, but. Yes, question?
The slot element you showed, is that where the shadow gets kind of inserted, or what is that element for?
Yeah, so the slot element is where, so you have like let me find one. Whoa, let me go back to like the slide. Did it kill my slide deck? Sorry. Let me go back. I'm almost there. Here we go. Like that. There? No? No? Oh no. Oh. Did this get mad? Cool. All right. So basically what it's doing is you write the part before it, right? You write this part. And then what the shadow DOM is that JSX style template that we put in there. And inside of that, that's the JSXy part that we wrote. And then what the browser is going to do is it's going to say like, well, I'm going to take that p tag, any element. You could have a whole blog post inside, but I'm going to take any elements that I see. I'm going to put them in the slot. I'm going to slot it into the shadow DOM area. But it's this weird thing where it's still light DOM. It's still DOM you control, like you wrote it and you can style it, but it just gets revealed, which is the word they use, inside the shadow. So it's kind of like a teleport, like a portal. I don't know. Think of like Portal the game. It's like an orange gun, blue gun or whatever. And so like you can like basically teleport content inside of the element. So, if piercing the shadow DOM wasn't confusing enough, teleporting is obviously clear. So sure.
So for the sake of time, I'm going to say that's the last question, although of course you can come up and ask Dave questions directly. I wanted to save the last 15, 20 minutes just if you guys have time to stick around. We don't have to be out of the room until 9, so we do have a few minutes to kind of meet and greet. If I don't know you, please come up and introduce yourself to me. Part of the reason of meeting in person is to make connections and meet people. So thanks a lot for coming out. Thanks again, Dave. Really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll see y'all next month. Thanks.